400 motorcycles were already idling in the parking lot of the Mesa Verde Fairgrounds when the little girl in the red hood walked out of the tree line alone, and not one of those engines was still running 30 seconds later. The silence came in a wave, rolling from the front row backward through the entire field, 200 yards of iron and leather, and men who had not gone quiet for anything in years. She was 8 years old. She was carrying a mason jar. And every one of those 400 riders would later say the same thing about the moment they understood why she had been standing there waiting, which was that nothing in 30 years of road had prepared them for it, and that the reason itself was the part nobody was ready for. The morning had started the way October mornings always start in the high desert above Ash Creek, Arizona, which was cold and flat and without apology. The sun came up low and hard out of the east, throwing copper light sideways across the scrub so that every shadow was long and every rock threw its own dark twin behind it. The temperature had not yet climbed to 40 degrees. The creosote smelled like rain that had not arrived. Darlow Reese turned 61 years old that morning, a fact he noted once and did not mention to anyone. And he was already on the county road by 6:15, riding alone the way he almost always rode the first leg of a run day, with the collar of his cut turned up against the cold and the road unspooling ahead of him in the coppery half-light, like something he had been promised a long time ago and never quite received. Darlow was not a large man in the way that people picture when they say large, but he was a wide man, barrel through the chest and shoulders, and the weight of the past 12 years of running the Ash Creek Riders showed in the set of his jaw and in the way his hands sat on the grips, not tight, not loose, but holding with a specific knowledge of how easily things got away from you if you stopped paying attention. His beard had gone gray 2 presidents ago. His knuckles were the knuckles of a man who had spent 20 years before the club doing body work in a shop that was always too cold in winter, and the skin on the backs of his hands was mapped with healed cuts, the way old asphalt is mapped with patched cracks. He had been founding member, road captain, and now president, and he was the last one of the original 7 still riding with the patch. The others had died or moved away or stopped. Darlow had not stopped. He had no particular reason to, and on the mornings when he examined that fact honestly, he understood it was not stubbornness but something closer to obligation, the sense that someone had to keep the front wheel pointed forward or the whole thing went into the ditch, and that someone had defaulted to him by elimination. The fairgrounds were 11 miles out. The full chapter run was scheduled for 9 o'clock. 61 other riders would be there by 8:30 for the pre-ride walkthrough and the breakfast that Donna Terracini had been cooking since 5 in the morning in the fairgrounds service kitchen, and beyond those 61 were the affiliated clubs, the independent riders, the support families, and the full chapter visitors who made the Mesa Verde Autumn Run the largest single gathering the Ash Creek Riders had hosted in 8 years. The number being thrown around was 400. Darlow had told his road captain, a lean and deliberate man named Curtis Pell, to plan for 450 and hope for 380, which was the way Darlow planned everything, with a margin for the world being worse than expected and a quiet hope that it wouldn't be. He came down off the Mesa Road onto the valley floor, and the fairgrounds appeared ahead of him, the white metal rooflines catching the early sun, and he could already see the bikes arriving in groups of 3 and 4, their headlights threading in from the north and south highways like slow sparks. He pulled into the main lot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the tick of cooling metal and the thin, high sound of the wind through the fairgrounds' aluminum fence posts. Whatever was coming, it had not started yet. Curtis Pell met him at the gate with a clipboard and a paper coffee cup and the expression of a man who had already resolved 2 problems before sunrise and was carrying a third unresolved. Curtis was 47, built like a fence post himself, with a brown beard going gray at the corners and the habitual squint of someone who spent most of his outdoor life facing into wind. 412 confirmed as of last night, Curtis said, handing over the coffee without being asked. Fuel station on the south lot has a pump issue. Orwell's already on it. Darlow took the coffee. He looked at the growing spread of machines across the lot, the way they sorted themselves by chapter affiliation without anyone directing them, the way the riders moved between bikes with the specific unhurried efficiency of people who had done this many times and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. "Pump'll be fine," Darlow said. 4:12. Curtis nodded. "Could be 4:30 by 9. Darlow drank the coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. Somewhere behind the service building a generator was cycling up, and the smell of pancakes and propane was beginning to move across the lot on the cold morning air. And everything about the scene was exactly what it should have been, which was the last time that morning that Darlow Reese could say that truthfully. She came out of the tree line at the northeast corner of the fairgrounds at 10 minutes past 8. The trees there were a thin stand of junipers that separated the fairground property from a dry arroyo and the unincorporated land beyond it, and the light through them was still the low copper of early morning, which was why several riders saw the red of her hood before they saw anything else. She was walking steadily, not running, not stumbling, just walking the way a child walks when walking is the only option left and she has already used up everything else. She came through the gap in the fence where 2 panels had been pushed apart, and she stopped just inside the lot and stood there. She was 8 years old. She was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt with the hood up and cinched so that only the oval of her face showed, and over the sweatshirt a denim jacket 2 sizes too large, and jeans that had been hemmed with what looked like electrical tape. On her feet she had rubber-soled boots that were a size too big, and had been stuffed with what appeared to be folded newspaper to make them fit. She was holding a mason jar in both hands, pressed against her chest, the way you hold something you have been told to be careful with. The jar had a lid on it. The lid had a name written on it in black marker. Darlow saw her from 40 feet away, and the coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Curtis saw her half a second later, and the clipboard came down. She did not move. She stood just inside the gap in the fence with 400 motorcycles and the people who rode them spreading out behind and around Darlow Reese. And she looked at all of it, and then she looked specifically at him, as if she had known which one to look for, and she waited. Nobody reached for a phone. That came later, when the crowd was larger and the context was less clear, and the human instinct toward suspicion had had more time to assemble itself. In the first 60 seconds, it was simply a child in a red hood, standing in a field of motorcycles, looking at a large gray-bearded man with a paper coffee cup, and the people nearest to the scene went quiet, not because they were suspicious, but because the stillness of the girl was arresting in a way that silence is the only correct response to, the way you go quiet at the sound of a hawk or at the sight of something burning at the end of a road when you are not sure yet what is burning. Curtis made a half-step forward. Darlow stopped him with a hand. He set the coffee cup down on the nearest bike seat and walked toward her alone. He walked slowly. Not because he was being careful, but because he was already understanding something. A thing you understand before you can explain it. In the chest, not the head. Something about the jar and the way she was holding it, and the name on the lid that he was not close enough yet to read. He crossed the 30 feet of open gravel. He stopped 4 feet from her, and he went down on one knee so that his face was level with hers, which meant his knee was in the cold grit of the lot and would ache for the rest of the day. He did not care about that. She looked at him with brown eyes that were steady and dry, no tears in them, which was its own kind of communication. "You ride here by yourself?" he said. She shook her head. "I walked from the Arroyo Road." The Arroyo Road was 3 miles from the fairground fence, through open scrub. He looked at the boots stuffed with newspaper. "How long have you been walking?" She considered this as though it were a math problem. "Since it was still dark," she said. "My name is Nora." She looked down at the jar in her hands and then back up at him. "This is my dad." The name on the lid was Reyes, T. Not a sound from the lot behind him. Not an engine, not a voice. 400 people, and the wind through the fence posts, and Darlow Reese on one knee in the gravel in front of a girl named Nora, who was holding her father in a mason jar. His mouth worked once and then he chose not to speak, which was the right choice. He looked at the jar. He looked at her face. There was a logic to this, to her being here, that he was not yet in possession of, and he understood without being told that if he waited and did not startle her, the logic would come. "You hungry?" he said, because that was what came. She looked past him at the service building. "Is that pancakes?" "Since 5 this morning," he said. She considered it. "Okay," she said. "But I can't put the jar down." "Nobody's asking you to," Darlow said. He straightened up, joints protesting, and he turned to find Curtis Pell standing 8 feet back with the clipboard at his side and an expression that had nothing professional left in it. Curtis looked at the jar, at the girl, at Darlow. Darlow gave him the smallest nod. Curtis turned without a word and went to the service building at a walk that was almost a run, and Darlow Reese held his hand out to Nora, not reaching for the jar, holding it beside him with the palm up and the fingers loose, in the way you hold your hand out to a dog you are not sure about. An offer, not a demand. After a moment she took it with her free hand, the one not holding her father, and they walked together toward the smell of the pancakes and the morning that was already gone from whatever it had been supposed to be. Donna Terracini did not say anything when Darlow brought the child through the service building door, except to look once at the jar, once at the boots, once at Darlow's face, and then to turn back to the griddle and start a fresh plate. Donna was 53 and had been feeding Ash Creek riders since the 2nd year of the club, and she had developed a precise understanding of when talking helped and when the only thing that helped was food appearing at the right moment. She set Nora at the end of the service table with a plate of pancakes and a glass of orange juice, and without being asked, she moved a tall stainless stock pot to the end of the table and set it beside Nora's plate like a sentry, which gave Nora a flat surface to set the mason jar on so both her hands were free to eat. Nora placed the jar carefully on the lid of the stock pot. She looked at it for a moment to make sure it was stable. Then she picked up the fork. Darlow stood at the other end of the table and drank what was left of his cold coffee, and watched her eat with the specific attention of a man who is cataloging damage without being able to stop it. The denim jacket was not hers. The sweatshirt was. The boots were her father's, or had been recently, given their size. She ate steadily, not frantically, which told him she was not in the acute part of hunger. She was in the part that comes after the acute part, the part that settles in after enough days have passed that the body stops signaling and starts simply enduring. He had been in that part once. He knew it by its specific flatness. Curtis came through the side door and stopped behind Darlow and spoke quietly. "There's a woman at the north gate asking about a child. Says her name is Rowan Reyes. Says she came down from the highway when she saw the bikes and she's looking for her daughter." Darlow looked at Nora, who was working through the pancakes with both hands now, the orange juice half gone. He said, "Bring her in. Not to this room yet. Front office." Curtis went. Darlow looked at Donna. "You good here for 5 minutes?" Donna turned enough to look at him. "Go," she said. "We're fine." Darlow looked at Nora. "I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere." Nora did not look up from the plate. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, as though this had never been a real question, as though staying was the one thing in her immediate world she was entirely certain of. Rowan Reyes was 34 years old, and she was wearing the face of someone who had been awake for most of the last 48 hours and had long since crossed the point where fear and exhaustion become the same thing. She was sitting on the edge of a metal folding chair in the fairgrounds front office when Darlow came in, and she stood up so fast the chair scraped. She was small, barely to Darlow's shoulder, and her dark hair was pulled back tight, and her coat was thin for the temperature, and she had the careful blankness of a person maintaining composure, through pure determination, because letting go would be catastrophic. "She's fine," Darlow said before anything else, because that was the right order of things. The woman's breath left her in a single long, controlled exhale, the kind that has been held for a long time. "She walked 3 miles, Darlow said. Rowan closed her eyes for a moment. "I told her not to. I told her last night not to." She opened her eyes. "She does what she decides to do. She decided to come here." Darlow looked at her. "She brought her dad," he said. It was not a question, and he said it quietly, giving her room around the words. Rowan looked at the wall beside him. 2 months ago. We've been in the car since September. The motel ran out last week. There it was. The whole shape of it, which he had been sensing in fragments since the girl came out of the tree line, arrived fully assembled in those 3 sentences. A dead father, a homeless mother, a child who had decided that a field full of motorcycle people was the correct solution to the problem of not having anywhere to be. A child who had carried her father's ashes 3 miles through the dark desert scrub in newspaper-stuffed boots, and had stood waiting in a gap in a fence with 400 bikes idling around her because she had decided this was where the help was. The precision of that conviction, the absolute accuracy of it. Darlow felt something move in his sternum, not a sentiment exactly, but more like recognition, the way a joint aches before rain because it has been broken and healed in the presence of that particular weather before. "There are specific things we can do right now," he said. "There are specific things we can do that are bigger than right now. I'd like to start with right now." Rowan Reyes looked at him for a long time. "Nora picked you," she said finally. "She told me last week she was going to come here and find someone. She told me she saw the bikes parked out front of the diner and she knew." Darlow thought about the mason jar on the lid of the stock pot and the girl's face that was dry-eyed and steady and had already decided. "How old?" he said. 8 in November. Smart kid." "Yeah," Rowan said, and her voice broke on just that one word, and she straightened her spine and it stopped. "She is." Darlow went to the door and opened it and called for Curtis, who appeared within 15 seconds because Curtis had been standing just outside, which was the thing about Curtis Pell, which was that he was almost always exactly where the situation needed him to be before the situation knew it needed him. Curtis ran logistics the way a river runs, which was by finding the shortest distance between where things were and where they needed to be, and moving that way without commentary or deviation. Within the first 40 minutes after Darlow came out of the front office with Rowan Reyes, Curtis had done the following. He had radioed the chapter's treasurer, a man called Burl Osteen, who was a retired general contractor and who drove a white truck and kept a laminated emergency contact sheet in his glove compartment at all times. He had located, through Burl's contact sheet, a motel on the Flagstaff Highway whose owner owed the Ash Creek Riders a specific civic debt from a specific evening 4 years prior, involving a parking lot and a situation that the owner had chosen not to think about since. He had confirmed with the owner, whose name was Patterson, that there was a ground floor room available immediately and that the rate would be covered for 2 weeks against a bill that Curtis would settle in cash on Monday morning. And he had gotten the keys from Patterson's nephew, who was already at the fairgrounds riding a borrowed touring bike, and had placed those keys in his breast pocket without telling anyone yet, because the order of operations required that the woman be asked before the thing was offered, not the other way around, because Curtis understood the difference between help and assumption. He delivered this information to Darlow in the corridor between the service building and the main hall, and Darlow listened to all of it without interrupting and said, "Good," and walked back to the service building. Nora had finished the pancakes. She had drunk all the orange juice and was looking at the mason jar on the stock pot lid with an expression that was not sad but was very specific, the kind of expression a person makes when they are explaining something to someone in their head. Rowan had come through the side door while Darlow was in the corridor and was now sitting beside her daughter at the table, and they were not talking, just sitting next to each other, the way people sit when the talking has temporarily run out, and the presence itself is the whole point. Donna set a coffee cup in front of Rowan without being asked. Darlow came and sat across the table from them, the first time he had sat down since 5 that morning, and his knee announced itself and he ignored it. "There's a room off the Flagstaff Highway," he said to Rowan. 2 weeks covered. No obligation attached. "We'd like to talk about what comes after that, but not right now. Right now, the room." Rowan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "We have the car," she said. It was not a refusal. It was a woman reminding herself what she had, so that she knew where she was starting from. "The car stays wherever you park it," Darlow said. "That's not going anywhere." Nora was looking at Darlow now, not at the jar. "We're staying?" she said to her mother. Rowan looked at her daughter. A long look, the kind that goes from one generation to another and carries everything that can't be said directly in the time available. "For 2 weeks we're staying," she said. "Okay." Nora picked up the mason jar from the top of the stock pot and held it against her chest. "He wanted to be in the mountains," she said, to nobody in particular. He said the mountains every time. Darlow looked at the jar. He had not lost a child. He had lost a brother, which was different. But the specific shape of an ashes-in-a-jar grief he understood from a different place, from 23 years back, from a different jar that had lived on his workbench at the body workshop for 11 months, because he had not been able to decide. And then from a Saturday morning in November when he had ridden to the rim and opened his coat against the wind and done the thing that needed doing, and from the specific quality of the ride home after, which was different from any ride before or since because the weight was different, both lighter and heavier in ways that language does not fully cover. He had not told anyone that story in a long time. "There's a ridge," he said to Nora, "about 14 miles east of here. You can see 4 ranges from the top. In the afternoon, the light does this thing where everything goes gold for about 20 minutes. Nora looked at him. "Is it in the mountains?" "It's as in the mountains as it gets around here," he said. She considered this with the gravity of a property manager assessing a unit. "Okay," she said. "Can we go?" "After the run," Darlow said. "There's 400 people outside who came a long way, and we're not going to leave them without a president. But after." She nodded as if this were entirely reasonable, which from where she was sitting it was. The run went out at 9:42, 22 minutes behind schedule, which Curtis Pell logged on his clipboard with the expression of a man cataloging a minor injustice that he intends to address in next year's planning. 419 riders, the count confirmed at the gate by Burl Osteen with a clicker, went out in formation down the county road south and swung east on the state highway toward the canyon country, and the sound of them together was the sound of sustained, controlled thunder, the kind that moves through your sternum and down into the ground under your feet, and the people in their cars on the crossroad waited at the stop signs and watched in the way that people watch things that are both impressive and slightly outside the edges of their existing categories. Darlow rode at the front because that was his position, and because it was his club, and because from the front you felt the whole mass of the thing behind you, as a specific pressure in the air, and that pressure was its own kind of comfort, on a day when you needed reminding what you were part of. Curtis rode his left shoulder. Behind them, in staggered double file, came the rest of the 417, and among them, in Burl Osteen's white truck at the back of the column where Donna had organized it with the efficiency of someone rearranging a kitchen to account for a new appliance, were Rowan Reyes and Nora Reyes, with the mason jar between them on the bench seat, headed east toward the canyon country and then north toward a ridge that got gold in the afternoon for 20 minutes. Because 419 people had collectively reorganized their morning around the decision of an 8-year-old girl who had walked 3 miles in newspaper-stuffed boots to find the right person to ask. There was a word for that kind of navigation, the kind done by children and by certain very old people who have stopped flinching at what they need. but the word was not one that appeared easily in ordinary conversation. Darlow thought about it for 14 miles and did not arrive at a satisfactory single word, and eventually he let it go and rode the road, which was gold at the edges in the late morning light, and wide enough for 419 and possibly more. The ridge road turned north off the highway at a cattle gate marked with reflector posts, and the trucks and bikes threaded through it in organized groups, while Burl Osteen stood at the gate and directed the sequence without needing to raise his voice. The ascent was a mile and a half of switchbacks on good gravel, steep enough that the touring bikes took it in first gear, but not steep enough to turn anyone back, and at the top the land opened out onto a flat shelf of wind-polished rock that looked east and south and west across the desert and north toward the San Francisco peaks, which were carrying the first snow of the season on their upper slopes, like something they had been given and had not yet decided what to do with. The light was climbing toward noon, not the gold at 20 minutes light yet, but clear and hard and enormous, the kind of sky that makes you aware of how small you are, not with dread, but with something more like relief. They parked in the loose order of people who have learned that order matters on narrow ground, and fanned out across the rock shelf, 200 and then 300 and then 400 of them, until the rock was covered in leather and denim and the particular posture of people who are waiting for something they are not sure how to perform. Rowan brought Nora to where Darlow was standing at the eastern edge of the shelf, looking out, and Nora was holding the jar and her hood was down for the first time all day. The wind on the ridge was cold and direct, and it moved her hair, which was black and fine and cut bluntly, and she stood at the edge with the jar and looked out at the desert below and the mountains north, and she did not look like a child who needed guidance about what to do next. She had already thought about this more than any of them. Darlow looked at the crowd behind them. More than 400 people standing on a rock in the high desert in the cold October wind, and none of them talking, all of them understanding without being told that the correct thing here was stillness and proximity, and nothing else. Not help, not instruction, just being there, which was the thing the Ash Creek riders had quietly been best at through their entire history, without ever having put it in words. Curtis was 3 feet behind Darlow's right shoulder. Burl was back by the gate keeping count. Donna had driven up in the supply truck and was standing near the front of the crowd with her arms folded and her coat collar up and a face that was doing work that no one was going to comment on. Nora looked up at Darlow. "The 20 minutes?" she said. Darlow checked the sky, the angle of the sun, the shadow the peaks were throwing south. "Maybe an hour," he said. "Okay," she said. She sat down cross-legged on the rock right where she was, at the eastern edge of the shelf, with the mason jar in her lap. People around her found their own places to stand or sit, and the mountain wind ran through 400 people without a single voice rising above it. Darlow sat down beside her, which took his knee apart a little more, and which he was entirely willing to pay. Rowan sat on Nora's other side. They did not talk. There was a hawk working the thermals below the ridge, riding the updraft in slow circles with the absolute economy of a creature that has mastered the specific physics of its world, and for a while the hawk was the only thing moving below them. It came at 22 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the low angle of the October sun crossing below a bank of cloud and striking the desert floor and the mountain faces at the precise oblique angle that turned everything the color of old honey, of autumn creek water over flat rock, of the inside of a wood fire seen through glass. The peaks went gold first, then the mesa tops, then the canyon walls, then the whole floor of the desert below the ridge, and the rock shelf they were standing on lit up last, catching the light from underneath where it reflected off the paler stone below the shelf's edge, so that for 20 minutes they were standing in light that came from below as much as from above, light that had no hard shadows in it, light like the inside of something warm. Nora stood up when it came. She held the jar at her side and looked out at it for a long time, and then she looked at the jar, and Darlow and Rowan both understood they were done sitting. Darlow stood. Rowan stood. Nora took 2 steps to the very edge of the shelf, where the rock dropped away, and the air took over, and the desert stretched out 4,000 feet below in its entirety, golden and enormous and still. She turned her back on it and looked at all those people, 400 of them standing on the rock in the afternoon gold, and she held the jar up so they could all see it. Then she turned back to the desert. She opened the lid. The wind took what was inside immediately and completely, as winds do at elevation, and what had been Rhea's tea went out over the desert and the canyons and the long slopes of the mountains in the finest possible dispersal, gold dust into gold light, until there was nothing left to see of it, and the jar was empty, and Nora held it at her side and looked at the desert for a long time, with nothing on her face except a kind of finishedness, a completed thing, the look of someone who has done the thing they came to do, and is now simply standing in the aftermath of having done it. Darlow heard it behind him, the sound of 400 people who have been holding the same breath, letting it go at once, which is not quite a sound and not quite not a sound, and which he would hear, in the specific acoustic memory that the body keeps separate from the ordinary mind, for the rest of his life. He looked at Curtis, who was looking at the peaks. He looked at Burl, who was counting nobody, but was holding his clicker against his sternum with both hands. He looked at Donna, who had finally stopped doing the work her face had been doing and was not pretending about it. Nora put the empty jar back against her chest, holding it the way she had been holding it all morning, pressed against the center of her, and she said to nobody and to everybody, at the edge of the shelf in the gold light, the same thing she had said when Darlow asked her what her name was, which was, "This is my dad." And then she was quiet, and the mountain was quiet, and all 400 of them were quiet, and the hawk was still down there working the thermals below them, unharmed and unhurried, riding everything the air had to give. The Ash Creek riders did not go back to the fairgrounds that afternoon until 4:30. People ate from the supply truck that Donna had organized and stood on the rock in the gold light and talked to each other in the way that people talk when something has happened that reorganized their sense of what the day was for, quietly and with the specific consideration reserved for conversations that feel important even when you cannot yet say why they are important. Curtis sat with Nora on the rock ledge for the better part of an hour, and she told him about her father, who had been a roofer, and who had grown up in Yuma, and who had been very good at card games, and who had liked the mountains the way people like places they did not grow up in, and cannot fully explain their feeling for. Curtis listened without filling the pauses, which was his particular skill, and when Nora ran out of things to say, he simply sat with her and they looked at the peaks together, and the conversation was finished, and that was entirely fine. Burl Osteen spent the afternoon on his phone in the manner of a general contractor who has identified a project, making calls in a series, each one building on the previous one in a logical chain that he did not explain to anyone, and did not need to because the chain would be visible in its outcomes. Rowan sat near the supply truck with a cup of coffee that Donna kept refilling, and a look on her face of someone who had been bracing for a very long time against a very large force, and was only just beginning to understand that the force had subsided. She did not say much. Neither did anyone around her. Nobody asked her about the car or the motel or what came next, because the afternoon was still the afternoon, and some conversations belonged to specific hours, and this was not that hour. The run home went south and west in the long amber of the late afternoon sun, 419 bikes and Burl's white truck making the county road vibrate for the better part of a mile, and Darlow rode at the front of it with the wind in his face and the peaks behind him and the specific weight of the day distributed evenly across both hands on the grips, which was the way weight felt when it was not yours alone. 3 weeks later, by vote of the full chapter at the regular Thursday meeting, the Ash Creek Riders established what they called the Desert Passage Fund, financed by a portion of every run's proceeds and a monthly contribution from the 31 full members, for the purpose of assisting families in documented transition, which was the wording Burl's lawyer recommended and which everyone accepted because the wording itself was not the point. The first disbursement of the Desert Passage Fund went to Rowan Reyes in the form of 2 months' rent on an apartment in Flagstaff, a security deposit, and the cost of a refrigerator that Burl Osteen's former crew installed on a Saturday morning in late October. The apartment had a window that faced north, and on clear mornings you could see the peaks from it. Nora had specified this requirement at some point during the week between the ridge and the signing of the lease. In the flat, declarative way she specified all requirements, and nobody had questioned it, and a window facing north had been found. The empty mason jar sat on the windowsill. Rowan had tried once, gently, to ask Nora about it, about whether they should put it away somewhere, and Nora had looked at the jar and then at the window and then at her mother and said, "He liked the mountains every time," and that had been the end of that conversation. The jar stayed on the sill. In the first year after the Desert Passage Fund was established, it assisted 11 families. In the second year, 23. By the 5th year, the fund had expanded to include affiliated chapters, and the annual contribution had grown to a number that Burl Osteen tracked in a ledger he kept in his glove compartment between the laminated emergency contact sheet and a pocket edition of the Arizona Building Code. At the 5th-year anniversary run, which went out from the Mesa Verde Fairgrounds on the second Saturday of October, 461 bikes made the ride to the ridge. Nora Reyes was 13 by then, and she rode in the truck with Donna at the back of the column, and she carried the empty mason jar on her lap for the whole drive up the switchback road, the same way she had carried it when it was full, pressed against her chest with both hands, because the jar had not stopped being her father just because it was empty. It had just become a different version of the same thing, which was the way things generally worked when you had the patience to let them arrive at their own meaning on their own schedule. Darlow Reese had learned this slowly, at the cost of 11 months and a workbench and a Saturday in November at the canyon rim, and it was the single piece of private knowledge he had that he recognized in the girl's hands the first morning, before he knew anything else. Before the pancakes and the ridge and the gold light and the 400 going silent and the hawk going on untroubled below them all, just him on one knee in the cold gravel looking at a small pair of hands holding a jar, as if it were the most natural posture in the world, which it was, which it is, which it will always be. Because some things you carry not because you cannot put them down, but because putting them down was never the point. And the roar of 400 engines going quiet at once is not the sound of fear, and it is not the sound of power, and it never was. It is the sound of attention, which is what a person sounds like when they finally know what they are looking at.